Thank you. Miigwech, kwe maji tayan ni wi ojibwe majines, mi etago da windamunagug miigwech ki pejayeg, minwa inain dagwak da dajik kamango, minwa da windamunagug bungi awian, wagosh nin indugu minwa migazi indo dem, kazagasqua jimeka gijinakadi o shkonigan wain jibayan. Namanji dogish benisado tagwan ojibwe moyan, gawi? English? English it is. They asked me to come and share with you for an evening. They didn't say anything at all about using a foreign language like English. No, it is strange though that I just give you a brief introduction in my Ojibwe language, which is one of the indigenous languages to this place right here. But mine's the language that sounds weird and strange and foreign and exotic to so many people, even who've called this home for most of their lives. And it's weird in this day and age. We're actually more segregated now than we were before desegregation. And as testy as politics is, or topics like race, you know, it's really strange that we haven't done more to more effectively, you know, bridge connections, build understanding, and work to address big issues in our society today. So it's always really heartening to see efforts like this that really do just that. And to see all of you, you know, taking your time on a beautiful Minnesota evening to come inside, thank goodness for the air conditioning, you know, to have a conversation like this. So in my introduction in Ojibwe, I was telling you that my native name is Wagush, which means fox. So I'm sporting my native bling today for my native name. And I'm from the Eagle clan, and I come from Leech Lake. So next res over. Yep. And I'm really excited to see you all here today. There's never enough time, even, you know, taking a whole evening or a couple of days to, you know, take a deep dive into something to exhaust a conversation. So today we're going to have some fun and do what we can, and then I'll just avail myself to you. I've got cards. You can, you know, stay in touch with me. I've got lists of resources on the website for free on a whole variety of topics, stuff for teachers, stuff for language enthusiasts, and so forth. So I'll be happy to try to connect you to more information too. And I'm going to make most of our time available to field your questions. So you can think about what they may be, and you can steer me in whatever directions you want. But I'll give you a minute or two on me, because none of us see the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are. And we're all different. And I realize this, you know, even within a Native community. I got a house full of Natives, and I don't even know what they're thinking half the time. You know? I represent one person's view and one perspective, and within any group of people, you're going to have all kinds of different perspectives. So even what I can share with you today will be one person's view. I mean, we can say facts of history, and there's a lot to share there, but at the same time, even the telling of a historical narrative is full of perspective. So this is Tom Stillday, and some of you may have met him. He was kind of a, you know, famous Native in Minnesota. He passed away, I want to say in 2007, 2008. He was the first person named chaplain for the state Senate in Minnesota who was not from one of the Abrahamic religious traditions. So that was him with his pipe opening up the Senate. And he had a great sense of humor. He'd say, "I'm praying for politicians. Boy, do they need it." I couldn't help but to think how prescient that was, you know, more than ever. But he, you know, he always had a fun way of laying things out. And I rolled the dice one year. We had a graduation banquet event for our Native students at the university. And I said, let's bring in someone who has a PhD in the School of Life, you know, who can speak to a relatable experience for our Native students. And they said, okay, who do you have in mind? I said, let's bring in Tom Stillday. He's really great. He's a fluent speaker, you know, he's a spiritual leader, and he'll have a lot of great stuff to share. And then I told Tom, I said, Tom, listen, don't wreck the agenda. We have to give out a lot of awards and stuff, so, you know, keep it short, focus on the students. You can tell a joke or two. And he got up there, he spoke for like an hour and a half straight. He didn't even breathe in and out hardly in between. And then he did it all in Ojibwe. And we had mixed company, so I'm watching the president and deans glazing over. And then when he was all done, he said, "All you people who study Indians, study that." And he went and sat down. So I thought he was great. But he had some good points. Like so often, there's been someone coming from outside of our communities saying, "We know better than you what's best for you. What's best for you is," and they'll come up with something like residential boarding schools for Native youth. Right? And you've been hearing about that a little bit in the news. What's going on in Canada is they've been finding these big unmarked graves with hundreds of Native kids buried there. And here in the United States, there were a lot of Native kids who died at the schools run by the US government or by the churches that they subcontracted the education work to here too. But schools like Carlisle and Haskell kept cemeteries and usually marked graves. So it's a little bit different scenario, but pretty comparable in some other ways too. All too often someone's come in from the outside and had an economic development plan or a suicide prevention plan or an educational turnaround plan or written a book about Native people without really talking to one. You know? And really, like, even the field of history has been, you know, if it's not an authenticated primary source document, which means what the Army officer wrote in his letter or what the chaplain at the fort wrote in his journal, you know, that's what they're using for sources. Well, where are the Native voices then? Even feeding the whole field of history. And it's weird, like, I couldn't imagine somebody saying, "I'm going to write a book on German history, but I'm never going to Germany and I will not speak German and I'm not talking to any German people." You know what I mean? It sounds preposterous because it is. But somehow that's really been the way that this craft has unfolded until quite recently. But I'm excited to say that over the past few decades, there's been a real change. And there are a lot of Native voices out there in, you know, adult literature, kids literature, history, social activism, and so forth. And there are a lot of authentic Native voices out there scrambling around trying to be heard. It's a bit of a different challenge now. The problem used to be like, how do I find a needle in a haystack? And now the problem is like, which needle in this pile of needles do I pay attention to? You know? So there's some different challenges now. But I do think that it's a vibrant time. There's a lot going on. Problems abound, but you know, great minds and thinking and creative effort abound too. So there's a lot out there for everyone to explore. So there's home for me, Leech Lake. You know, you're probably familiar to most of you up here. And you know, I think all of us, well, obviously all of us as human beings have ancestors, but I think for most Americans, the connection to ancestors has been really challenged. And it is something definitive about being Indigenous, is this longer, deeper connection to place and also to ancestors and things like that. My relatives have been buried in the Bena Cemetery longer than America's been a country. You know, like Tom Stillday, their custom in Panema is actually to bury the dead in the front, right in front of the house. So if you drive up there, you'll see all these spirit houses where everyone's buried. So you can't go out and mow the grass, you know? But you step out the door to your house and there's mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, generation upon generation, older than America. And it makes it hard to sell the family farm and move to California. Right? But let's face it, that's kind of the American dream. We celebrate our freedoms in America so much that if you get a job and the job's in California, we say, go, spread your wings, fly, pursue the dream. And we kind of prioritize financial prosperity, even materialism, you know, over community and long generations of connection to a place. So much so that most Americans, maybe they've got a couple kids and they move to 2 different states, and we use Facebook and FaceTime and try to keep it real, but people don't grow up with their first cousins being their best friends living in the same space as often as used to be the custom, right? Here, even for the early Scandinavian and German immigrants who came here, there would be a dozen siblings, and they'd all land in the same, square mileage, with various different farms, and they'd be raising their kids and going to the same churches and, all these sorts of things. Everyone's spread out now. And so I think a lot of Americans know their parents and grandparents and the names of their great-grandparents, and beyond that, might not know their names or maybe even where they're buried. And so it's different. It's different. And for me, that connection to place feels strong and different. And even being in, where our family cemetery is, it feels quite ancient. But, I'm a modern person too, right? And that's part of the challenge and the beauty, I think, for a lot of Native people, certainly for me, that I feel I'm ancient and modern all at the same time. I'm not something that happened in the past. I'm here today, feeling pretty good. It's not like it's a shame they killed all the Indians. I'm feeling great today, But we are thousands of years of human history still in the making. But the absent narratives that most Americans get leave a lot of room for us to imagine and not a lot of opportunity to deeply understand. And it cuts many different ways, right? So there's a really cool TED Talk, and you might not remember the name just hearing it, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's a Nigerian literary figure, but it's pretty easy to remember the title of the talk, which is The Danger of a Single Story. And in there, it's worth the 15 minutes, in there she says the problem with stereotypes isn't that they're incorrect, so much as incomplete. That we get a thin little single story narrative and think that's how it is for a whole group of people. So we hear about indigenous poverty or the poverty of black communities, and we think, oh, those poor people. And then we forget that in 16 counties in Minnesota, tribes aren't just big employers, they are the biggest employers of all. Be nice to natives, you probably end up working for one someday. Right? And if that's all you look at and think all the natives are rich from casinos, you're going to misunderstand when 50% of native kids are below the poverty line. So it's not one narrative, one story. There's more than one thing. And by the way, we could say the same thing about the white experience in America too, right? You take one thin single story narrative of poverty in rural white Appalachia and you'd be like, those poor people. Or why don't they have a work ethic? How come the moral fiber of the community is so disintegrated? And start looking down our nose at white folk. Or you take another thin single story narrative of white folk on New York's Upper East Side and you'd be like, talk about everything handed on a silver platter. Whew! Of course it's complex. It's humans. There's a diversity of experiences, and they're across a spectrum and in different places, but also even in the same place. Right? For Native people, we have rich, vibrant languages and cultures, and at the same time, we are stressed out trying to keep those things going. Both things are true. Right? There's a deep sense of community and connection to place, and about 50% of the enrolled tribal citizens live off-reservation. Hennepin County, Twin Cities, Minneapolis, has one of the highest native populations in the state of Minnesota. So there's an urban indigenous experience. It's not just the res. Although that connection to place is a big part of us too. So for me, like this guy John Smith, he was kind of famously photographed too, by the way. He was born in the 1700s and he died in the 1900s. So he was in Minnesota before white settlement, and he was still here when they were sending folks off to World War I. Amazing to think about the changes he saw in his lifetime. Didn't sign any treaties, even though all these treaties happened during his lifetime, and someone still used them to take the land away and confine him to a smaller part of his original land. You know? Or this guy Wabujig, he's kind of a famous warrior in the Ojibwe world. These are folks in my family tree, and I didn't have the tools to talk about this when I was going to school, but it started to bother me as I got older that I could go to school for 13 years in a row, K-12, to learn what I needed to be successful in the world, but none of it had anything to do with me. The message that was screaming at me through the absent narratives from good-hearted people who wanted me to succeed, that message was, you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. And I think, I'm not going to go too much, unless you want to ask questions about it, into, some of the racial discussion that's going on in America right now, but it's a really important topic to grapple with. But I think there's a lot going on that we just have to develop the vocabulary and the courage to have conversations about and address and do something about. Like, white privilege isn't about money. It's the privilege of being able to go to school and have someone from your own racial group teach you something. That's a privilege white people always get in America, but that people of color don't always get. Or the privilege of going to school and learning about your history. White folk get that. Get to find out about how white folk helped make America a great, wonderful place. My history wasn't there. Even though, if you look at the history of the Iron Range, and you add up the thousands of years of human habitation, the glaciers retreated around 11,000 years ago, and there have been humans here ever since. And I actually told this to the executive director for the Minnesota Historical Society. Really, the white guy history, it's statistically insignificant. So if we align our resources and programming that way, we're going to get along great. And he was just like a deer in the headlights, but yeah. But it is weird that we start with the arrival of the first white guy, like the first French voyageur, or the first logger, or whatever. Fort Snelling, And there's so much history here. And it tells us so much. So we're going to start, with tackling this topic, connection to place. We'll talk a little bit about who the Ojibwe are and how we came into being and how we got here and stuff like that. And then we'll field questions. A little bit on my folks, too. There's always, with the iceberg, there's the tip of the iceberg and then everything below the surface. So here's my father. He wasn't native at all. He was an Austrian Jewish immigrant and a Holocaust survivor. He spoke nothing but German first 13 years of his life. And so he and two cousins and both of his parents made it out. It's a pretty harrowing tale, and I'm happy to share about his story too. Everyone else died in the camps, over 300 family members. And the short version of the story is eventually he made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. My mom grew up in a little village of Bena on the Leech Lake Reservation. Population 400, about half of them are my cousins. And I think for her, things like harvesting wild rice and stuff like that was less a cool cultural pastime and more necessary means of survival. All the kids were involved in food production and stuff like that. I have my kids heavily involved in food production too, but it's more to keep us real and recognizable to our ancestors, and because it's fun and it's food Monsanto hasn't colonized yet, and stuff like that. And also because they can walk around with the sense of confidence that I know how to get food out of a tree. And they know the science of that, and they know the art of that, and those things are identity forming and so forth. So for me, I'm almost in a more privileged position to be able to do that, or that I've been doing these activities my whole life. So it's different, I think, for my mom as she was going through that. I'll skip a couple of these. Let's see. There's me as a tyke. Yeah. When you could say my dad was hitting the restart button and my mom was trying to find a pathway out of poverty. And There were some humble beginnings. You know, there was a time, my kids think it's dinosaur ages, where we had a little hand pump, you know, and we had kerosene lanterns. There wasn't electricity or running water, a little outhouse, wash up in the creek in the summer, enamel wash basins in the winter. I never had food insecurity, always well taken care of, a couple of loving parents. Saw big changes. By the time I hit middle school, my mother had become the first female native attorney in the state of Minnesota. Built a nice house. Economic profile for our family changed. And to me, it revealed a couple things. One was the power of an education. And there's no disputing it. You know, the economic data shows what happens if you haven't finished high school all the way up through getting a terminal degree. And there's a financially predictable result of what happens. At the same time, you can finish college and still be working in Starbucks. It doesn't guarantee you a result. It's a lever that improves your chances, but doesn't guarantee you that result. And I'm also still kind of with George Carlin. Do you remember the old comedian? And he was like, yeah, we call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. That there are barriers out there, and those barriers are not equitably distributed. By gender, by race, by sexual orientation, and a whole host of other things. And so, as a result, you know, you can even just think about what people with money do, you know, create trust funds and find ways to keep the money in the family and that kind of thing. So wealth self-perpetuates, and that means poverty does too, right? And it's pretty much the same with all the isms. They naturally self-perpetuate. There's my crew. I have 9 kids. It is never dull. Yep. And I'm in the grandbaby business now too. I have 3 grands. Wow. Yep. Once they started reproducing on their own, we threw in the towel and said, that's it. Yep.
Is there a wife in there somewhere?
There is. She's in the middle of the pile. She's right there. Yeah. She's from the Swedish-American tribe. Yeah, familiar to many of you, blonde hair, blue eyes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, from a seafaring, warlike group that tells long legends. There's home. I kind of feel like Shrek. That's my swamp. When my folks were getting started, my dad had put in a bid on a piece of tax forfeited property, and he got a letter back saying, yours was the only bid, but it's not enough money to cover the delinquent taxes. Can you find a couple $100 extra bucks? Which he borrowed and got a big farm for relatively little money. At one point, it had been a virgin pine forest that had been clear-cut and turned into farm fields. And he started planting trees. And in fact, here's what it looked like when he first got the farm. And that's what it looks like today. He planted all those trees in that picture there. Transformed the landscape and the ecosystem. One dude with a child labor force. That's me. Yeah. And that's where I live now. And so for me, it's pretty powerful to step outside and think about how one person had an idea that changed everything. It's humbling. And then at the same time, when I think about how do we deal with climate change, how do we deal with race relations in America, we look at these big, seemingly insurmountable issues. And I think a lot of us look at that stuff and think, oh, there's not much I can do about it. I'll try to be decent human. I'll tell my kids to be decent humans. I hope it's enough. But it's never quite enough, because all that's necessary for evil to triumph is good people to do nothing or too little. And the problems are so big. But it's not like we need to take this mountain of problems that humans have been making for thousands of years and like move that whole mountain right now. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it can transform the entire landscape and ecosystem. And that's the work. That's what we do in education. That's what we do in all kinds of endeavors, to plant seeds, to nourish them, to help them grow. And we don't win every single one. Not every single seed makes it to a big towering pine tree, but the forest can thrive if we tend to the planting and nourishing and nurturing efforts. So we have a lot of power. Yeah. All right. So why don't I just give you a little bit on who the Ojibwe are and where the Ojibwe come from and how we've shifted and changed a little bit over time, and then we'll just start fielding questions and you can take me wherever you want to. So a couple of things just about humans. First of all, we change way faster than most people realize. So the English language, when it was first really written down, I mean, anyone ever try to read Geoffrey Chaucer? Like, he was written about 600 years ago. It was one of the first attempts to write English. And I'm smart, I got a PhD, I speak English well, I can barely read Chaucer. Woo, you know? So 600 years of language is really small when you look at thousands and thousands of years of human beings being on the planet, right? In fact, most of the languages across Europe and big chunks of Asia come out of Sanskrit. Really, they have a mother group, even though they've branched out into different language families and so forth. And even languages like German and English, which are both in the Germanic language family, means they're linguistically cousins. You can't always understand what's going on in German if you're an English speaker, right? So just bear in mind how quickly humans change. And even look at the language change we've seen over the past 20 years. Words like motherboard and firewall are pretty common to us, but might have freaked somebody out a few generations ago, right? So with regard to humans in the Americas, if you're reading anything that's over 10 years old, it's probably out of date because the field has been shifting very quickly. And some of the interesting stuff going on now is that we're getting the epigenetic and the genomic mapping stuff is telling us a lot. The linguistics, the scientific field is also telling us a lot. And other parts of archaeology and history, they're all starting to talk to each other. And we're starting to figure some stuff out that nobody knew about even just 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. It's shifting quite a bit. So just bear in mind, if you're looking at an older book, it's probably missing some of the newer studies. And so, the genetic and linguistic stuff is pretty successful at identifying three major groups of indigenous people. They still haven't determined exactly who got here, exactly where, exactly how, exactly when. There are more questions than answers. And the theories are kind of interesting. It used to be, they found human tool cut marks on a bison bone in Clovis, New Mexico. And they're like, humans definitely did that. And they did some carbon dating and they're like, okay, it's a little over 10,000 years old. So 10,000 years ago, but we found evidence of humans in a cave in France, that was 40,000 years ago. And in Java, 60,000 years ago. And in Africa, 200,000 years ago. And so the theory was, well, humans came from the oldest stuff we found to the next oldest, to the next, to the next. And so they kind of drew a little map, and that was the theory. And then every so often they'd find something else older or different, or a break in the, evolutionary thinking, and they'd have to, go back and redraw stuff. And now we've got, I think, at least 50 sites under excavation. A lot of them are in South America. Some are actually even in places like Pennsylvania, and they're just pushing the dates around. So we also know that there were cyclical heating and warming periods on the planet. And so when there was a big ice age, you had a number of things happening. So ocean levels are much lower. There was a lot of, it's not just that things were frozen, but there was a lot of moisture inside of the glaciers accumulated through a series of geological events. And so there's evidence of traffic across, the Bering Strait. There's even evidence of prehistoric horses and camels in the Americas, but not anywhere else. And theories that there was two-way traffic, horses and camels coming this way, you know, woolly mammoths and stuff going that way. But then there were all these questions like, if humans are following food, woolly mammoths this way, and there's food coming this way, why would you move? And then there were these questions about like, what do large vegetarian animals eat walking across thousands of miles of ice? And they're pretty good questions, right? And so the thinking has really shifted and evolved, and now we're finding, you know, like some kinds of boat construction amongst some indigenous people in Chile that is only otherwise found in parts of Polynesia, suggesting there may have been a seafaring route there. It's pretty clear now that the Inuit groups, who we've sometimes called Eskimo based upon the Ojibwe and Cree word Eshkimu, which means raw eater, and it isn't really favorably viewed by the Inuit, that they were a much more recent group, and that really, encircling the entire Arctic, there's a genetic connection between all of those groups. And so that's about as far as the science has brought us. And then the theories abound from there. One of the pieces of information that really hasn't been included in most of the scholarship is, what do Native people say about their origins? Right? And they say a lot of different things. Sometimes they're not the same thing as one another. The Hopi have stories of the emergence of people through a hole in the ground. Other groups speak about a great flood. And most cultures of the world do have a story of a great flood. And that's because when ice ages ended, they sometimes ended in great dramatic fashion, and there were huge floods that covered big chunks of the planet. So, including an ice dam that went out on Hudson's Bay and dramatically rose ocean levels at one point, throughout this part of the world and points east of there. So anyways, all of that makes it really interesting. But if you look about 10 to 12,000 years ago at what's now England, Wales, and Ireland, it was all ice. There were no humans living there. There were definitely had been humans here for thousands of years by then. So the other piece to that equation is an impulse to say, hey, we're all immigrants here. Right? And it's politically loaded because that means also there were all immigrants here and there were scattered bands of roaming nomads, so there was room for everyone else. The coming wasn't a taking, and it was somehow justifiable because we're all immigrants. Right? And so those things feed those narratives, and it's good to have that on our minds. Sometimes we get lost in an academic channel about the dates and things like that, and it does matter, but if anyone was ever indigenous anywhere in England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, the native people here are indigenous to this place and have a very long and ancient history here. That said, we moved around a lot. So the Ojibwe, like in our oral history, talk about a migration from the Atlantic coast. And it's really most likely, there are 29 different tribes in the Algonquian language family, so they're like linguistic and also biological cousins to the Ojibwe, that regardless of the movement patterns leading up to this, a couple thousand years ago, there was a migration, and this is long before contact with, sustained contact with Europeans, but there was a migration from the East Coast west. And there were a number of things fueling that. The East Coast had abundant food resources. So there's fish in the ocean, there's fish in inland lakes, there's a diverse ecosystem. The land was well suited for indigenous agriculture, and you had a dense population. And then if there was a cyclical drought or things like that, there's a whole bunch of people to fight with each other. And so you would sometimes get conflict, and that was a fuel for migration. And then we also have stories about prophets who said, move west to the land where food grows on water, which is a reference to the wild rice. And that's how a lot of Ojibwe people have understood this to be like soul food for Ojibwe people. Over a period, it wasn't like a straight march, and all of this area was already occupied by other people. So as the Algonquian-speaking people started to move west, they started to branch out, and that's really how you got the differences between the Ojibwe and the Ottawa and the Potawatomi, Menominee, Cheyenne, and others. Some groups blazed all the way through. There's one Algonquian group made it all the way to California. Yep, and so the diaspora is pretty interesting to map and look at. And the Ojibwe have a huge territory. Turtle Mountain, North Dakota, and Rocky Boy, which is in Montana, is Ojibwe Cree, heading west. And then going east all the way up to the Quebec border at Bearskin Lake. North, there are 141 Ojibwe First Nations in Canada. And then here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, lots of Ojibwe communities. And big, dialect differences and stuff. And in spite of that, move west to the land where food grows on water, Turtle Mountain, North Dakota, and, Temagami on the Quebec border, wild rice doesn't grow in either place. They're both Ojibwe though, right? So it just gives you a sense for like how different even within a tribe things can be. There's a lot to say, and if you want, I'll take you deeper into Ojibwe-Dakota relations and relations between specific tribes, but the Dakota predated the Ojibwe here. Also, there's evidence of some of the other Siouan and Algonquian-speaking peoples who came through and probably evolved as they came through Minnesota. Cheyenne from the Algonquian language family, Hidatsa, Arikara, and the Siouan language family had homes here too. Yeah, and so there's, what happened before the Dakota got to this area is another question. We have more questions than answers about, but the Siouan language family, which includes Dakota, is another big one with its own story. All of that said, this land is paradise. It really is. And in so many different ways. As the glaciers pushed through, we say push through, but it's like, moving half an inch a year. But through that process, scraped the topsoil off of what's the Canadian Shield. And, the Iron Range is right on the edge of the Shield country. So when you get into the boundary waters, you can see boreal forest and, balsam and, popple and things like that, but not so much, some of the hardwoods and things like that you'll find in other places. And it scraped that and kind of scraped it across northern Minnesota so that the topography changes. Bemidji, just a little ways west of here, has lots of shallow lakes, which are basically pebbles pressed underneath the glaciers and deposited most of that topsoil along the Red River Valley and even points south of there, which, white folk came and they said, the largest swath of grade A agricultural land on planet Earth, But to indigenous people, what it meant was this area had abundant moose, woodland caribou. By the way, a lot of people don't know that. We had dense herds of woodland caribou. There's even a state season for hunting woodland caribou through the early 1900s until they were hunted almost to extinction. There's a tiny little herd on north shore of Lake Superior on the Canadian side. But, the topography had, the big duck and goose migrations, waterfowl populations. There was abundant small game, large game. The land was well suited for certain types of indigenous agriculture around the southern Great Lakes. And then right up to here, you get kind of a really diverse economy, which is important. Different ways to get food means it's easier to survive. If you just got one food source, you're very vulnerable. And so the land was able to support lots of people because it's cold out there, right? We think that now, but there was a mini ice age from 1550, through the middle of the 1800s. And if you read like Zebulon Montgomery Pike, he's talking about trying to drive horses up the Mississippi River in the middle of the winter, and because it was frozen all the way down through Missouri every winter. And the snow was too deep and they couldn't make it through, so they're eating horses and all this crazy stuff. Like, it's almost unimaginable. Snowshoes a requirement to get from one place to another. But somehow, people lived here, maintained thousands of people in this area on the food resources in this area, sustainably harvesting those resources in this area. They had to know something, you know? And it's a pretty remarkable story. All right, I'll say that much just to kind of prime the pump and get us started. You can ask your questions, and we can just jump all over the place. If something's relevant, I can pull up something in the PowerPoint, but feel free to guide me. And then when we run out of time, someone can cut me off, and I'll stick around and visit and shamelessly sell books and give you cards, and we can visit more on the side too. So who wants to get us started? Go ahead.
My name is Jean Mackey. I'm president of the Virginia Area Historical Society. And absent narratives is something that has been in my consciousness for probably 10 years. How do we incorporate absent narratives into our local, tiny historical society?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I don't know if you could hear it, but the question's about how do we incorporate and address absent narratives within our historical society. And I would say, first of all of us have blind spots, and no one's going to have all the information on everyone. Like, humans are just too complicated. But what we can do is open doors, create connections, develop resources, seek out and cultivate relationships, and amplify, marginalized voices so that they can be heard. There are a lot of different ways to go about it, but for, a regional historical society, whatever you can do to get resources into your historical society, to use your voice to get those resources into the schools, and, throughout your networks, to connect people. And, I kind of think travel, education, these things are pretty fatal to prejudice. And when we really understand someone or a whole group of people, then, it really does a lot to advance our shared humanity. It's really important work. And, ultimately, for most of the lives of at least our grandchildren, there isn't even going to be a racial majority group, right? So we want to create a culture, a shared culture that says everyone's voice matters, everyone's story matters, and we don't want to fight over who gets to be the oppressor and who has to be the oppressed. Use all that energy and just fight oppression, right? So the system works for everyone, so that everyone can be heard and validated. And saying that's one thing and doing it's another. So there's a lot of structural support for keeping things marginalized and silent and stuff like that. And it's unfortunate, but we have to do extra work to overcome those things. And it requires something that kind of runs counter to our Minnesota NICE training, which is to be so conflict averse that we're communication averse. And, we've got a new neighbor, let's drop off a casserole and give them their space, and that kind of stuff. And to actually actively look for views that are different from our own. To think about, in this politically testy time, all the people we want to give a good talking to and, give them a good listening to. Really? And to build that as the way we operate. And, I don't know if I held up my finger and said, what is that? It could even start a fight. In this day and age, right? Unless we clarify the language we're using to talk about it. Because in the language of body parts, indeed, that's a finger. But in the language of numbers, well, that's a 1, right? And in the language of space, well, that's up. Who's right? Well, they're all right. It's a matter of perspective. But all too often, someone's up there saying, here's a finger, it's not an elbow, it's not a toe, the rest of you, shh. And somebody else is listening going, that's a 1, not a 2. See, they just don't understand. And we miss each other. So as you can find ways to elevate those marginalized voices, to pull them in, it makes a huge, huge difference. I was really, Canada has been stumbling, bumbling, and rumbling too. They've gotten it wrong plenty. They're still getting it wrong, plenty. But they've been braver than we have in the United States in that they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they said, let's examine what happened with the residential boarding schools. And their own finding was that the Canadian government engaged in cultural genocide. That was the initial finding. Now they're finding out about like the physical genocide, and they're like, oh man, it's worse than we thought. You know, and so, but they're grappling with this. And if you ever make it up to Winnipeg, the National Canadian Human Rights Museum is there, which, you know, it's cool that they don't put everything in, you know, Toronto or Ottawa. And anyways, it's a really cool museum. The first floor has a series of kind of kiosks that are about elevating absent narratives. And so I learned a lot going through there. Like, I read a lot and study a lot, but I learned all kinds of things. So you know, there was one on the Canadian government's internment of Japanese Canadians in World War II. I didn't know that happened. I thought that was just the US that did that. Like, that was a big surprise. There was active persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Canada. I didn't know that either. You know, there was a story about you know, Nazi Holocaust refugees who actually made it on a boat, got out, came to Canada, were denied port, went back, and were all killed. You know, I was like, I didn't know that either. You know, and so I was going through looking at all these things, and by the time you went through, there was such a diversity of narratives that I think everybody in Canada could see themselves reflected in them somehow, and could make the connection that my narrative has in some way been excluded or marginalized too, which could generate some empathy with everyone else's. Second floor was about how that got scaled up, you know, Nazi Holocaust, stuff like that. Third floor was about people who've done things to tackle oppression. So, you know, there was Gandhi, King, you know, stories like that. And the top floor was all about the visitor. Is there a story about Canada that didn't make it into this museum? You tell the story right now, and you can sit down at a computer kiosk and it'll go into the national record. Do you want to get involved? And there are all these different groups that were doing things to, you know, try to make the world a better place. And so, like, you know, the institution, I think, did a good job. Of course, it's a national museum, but of elevating some of those stories and then creating opportunities to connect people, you know, to them in a way where they could see themselves and actually participate as change agents. Because I think that's the other thing that once people feel like, I see everyone's humanity, I want this to be different, what can I do? And that question comes up. And so, you know, institutions, even a small regional historical society, can help connect people to things. You don't have to have all the answers, you know. You can just say, I'm going to help you find them. And then, you know, you build resources and the relationships too, you know, really, really important.
I think one thing that we can't incorporate absent narratives by displaying a replica pair of moccasins.
Right. Yeah. Right. It's like, what would happen if you had the all-male gender equity team? Right? Be probably missing a vital perspective. Yep. And the optics aren't so good. Right? And that's what happens when you have the, like, all-white racial equity team. Yeah. Right? And things like that. And so you end up imagining rather than relating to. And then it's very easy. There are all kinds of potholes, and if no one's there to point them out, you're going to step in them, right? And so that could be, you know, just speaking to food, fun, and folklore, or, you know, objectification of culture or cultural appropriation. Those are all easy mistakes to make. But if you have someone there and they'll be like, you know, try it like this, not like that, or you know, they're in the room with you. That's why the relationship stuff is so important. They can just help guide things. And I realize that it's hard to do. And it's hard on, you know, it's good to try to understand what's happening from other perspectives too. Like, for me as a Native person, I get asked to be on all kinds of boards and committees and things like that. And sometimes people just want window dressing or a way for me to be used to help get buy-in, rather than for my ideas and contribution and try to build something together. So if I smell the former, I'm out, you know? But if it's a genuine engagement opportunity and I've got time, then I'm more likely to be in. And so that's where they're like cultivating the connections and relationships. And it's kind of like, we're like fish. You know, we're swimming around, we can see everything in our environment perfectly, except for the glass bowl that confines us. And here we are swimming along, being good little fish, and then bonk, we run into the wall. I'm like, why are those people mad at me? Bonk, you know, how come they're so frosty? You know, and stuff like that. So what do we need to navigate is some sonar, which is sound waves going out and sound waves coming back. It's a conversation with all those different stakeholders. You got to stay patient and persistent, open, and that's also, I mean, there's a lot to unpack about. You know, a lot of times we tippy toe in, we're walking around on eggshells because I think a lot of people are afraid of offending someone or like exposing an ignorance. And when we're adults and professionals, they expect us, if we say anything, we're supposed to be content experts, but no one ever told us anything. You know what I mean? Like it makes it so clunky. And so, so people get defensive and you know, it's just really hard to navigate. But if we're instead curious and open and, you know, looking for the connections, not just keeping this weight, you know, on ourselves, that's when real change happens and real education can happen. So you get to be a conduit that helps that.
I'm trying to picture what this program would have been like had it been set in the offices over at Pineville Court.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, everything matters. You know, the team, the venue, you know, yeah. I'm on the board for the State Historical Society, and you should see them fight. You know? Yeah.
Question about the migration.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of wondering about the Algonquian-speaking peoples, in particular the Ojibwe.
Yeah.
Coming this way, like the timeline, one.
Oh, yeah.
And speaking of the range, so the Dakota were in Minnesota. Were the Dakota woodland people, and were they actually here on the range in northern Minnesota, in the boreal forests? Or, and you know, then when the Ojibwe came this way, there was conflict and displacement and so on.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. So first of all, on the timeline, I would say that great Algonquian migration, which I guess we'd have to call the more recent one, really started a couple thousand years ago. So even this sometimes surprises some Ojibwe people who think I've lived here for 10,000 years or something, but that migration probably started a couple thousand years ago. The archaeological stuff, you know, typing pottery and things like that tend to support that. And honestly, the emergence of the Ojibwe as a tribe, distinct from the other tribes in the Algonquian language family, it was probably starting then. And maybe 1,500 years ago, the Ojibwe are becoming distinct from the other groups. The DNA was here much longer, but the, you know, Ojibwe language and culture as a distinct thing, I would say 1,500 years ago, maybe 2,000 at the outside. Of course, it had its roots from earlier stuff. Sometimes they call the mother group Proto-Algonquian. We don't even know what they called themselves. So with regard to arrival in this particular spot, you know, the migration didn't just like everyone packed up their bags and, you know, moved to the Iron Range. You know, it happened over a period of time, and sometimes there were, you know, bursts, and there was sometimes conflict because there were other people living there. And so it really happened over a period of hundreds of years. When the French first arrived in the Great Lakes, or, you know, in the central Great Lakes, 1600 or so, the Ojibwe had a population nexus around Sault Ste. Marie. And there probably were not Ojibwe people living in the Iron Range in 1600 at all. And then it's really interesting, you know, their whole chain of events. I don't know, you want me to tell you the long or the short version of this? You want the long version? Okay. So, yeah, I could boil this down to blame it on the Frenchmen. That's the short version. No. So in the 1600s, you've got global conflict going on with France and England. Of course, they fought each other for hundreds of years. You know, they're just really off and on at each other's throats. But they also were like all intermarried with each other and stuff like that, and sometimes colonizing one another. You know, the power dynamics are shifting. So that whole relationship got brought here. On the East Coast, you had first Dutch and then British kind of supplanting the Dutch. New Amsterdam becomes New York, you know, that kind of stuff. And they're at odds with the French trying to colonize. Are you familiar with like the doctrine of discovery and some of that stuff? So that's a whole nother talk, but essentially, you know, the Catholic Church had a series of papal bulls or edicts, you know, named after the bulla or wax seals on papal documents, designed to like get the Christian kings of Europe to quit killing each other and go on crusades and kill Muslims. Is basically what they're trying to do, and said that, you know, France gets to colonize here, England there, Portugal there, Spain there, and only Christian kings are preordained by God to rule, all others to serve, and so any Christian king or their vassal can go to some other land, claim ownership of that land and all those people, right? So it sets up the age of exploration and discovery. And so at that point in time, it also sets up our like racial stuff now, because at that point in time, all the Christians were in Europe and some parts of the Middle East. Everyone else on the planet is not white, right? And so the fault line goes, you know, from religion to race. All the indigenous people are people of color, and then here they come planting flags, claiming ownership of them and their bodies and that kind of stuff. So France and England were fighting with each other in part over who gets to plant the flags and claim ownership of the land and all the people. And they waged proxy wars with each other. So the British were like, you know, they formed an alliance with the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy. There were initially 5 tribes. The 6th tribe joined later on. And they said, here are a bunch of guns. Go kill some Frenchmen and go kill some of whoever the French are being friendly with, you know. And then it took the French a little bit longer, but eventually they reciprocated, and the French forged alliances with the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, 3 Fires Confederacy. And so you had these 2 powerful and numerous indigenous confederacies that the French and British are using as proxies fighting each other. And of course the French and British were killing each other and killing natives too, right? So that's all going on at the same time, all over the eastern seaboard and the Great Lakes. And some tribes really struggled that were caught in the middle, like the Huron. They're an Iroquoian tribe, but not part of the Confederacy. They were just as numerous as the Iroquois, but they had huge villages, dense population. They were decimated by smallpox and displaced by the Iroquois. Some were taking refuge in this part of the world. They were so displaced. And they never recovered population or territory in that. The British set up colonies and brought white women and made babies with white women. The French did the same thing in eastern Canada, but from, you know, all over Ojibwe country, they only sent men. And they said, you marry native women and you cement our relationships through the breeding. And that was their custom. Today, 1/3 of Ojibwe people have French surnames. Well, it depends on what you call working, you know. So the breeding certainly happened. It shifted over time. There's more to unpack there too, because the French had their own system and patriarchy, and they would take the boys and send them back to France for a formal education, and then bring them back and put them to work. So they'd look just as brown as me, but they were Catholics through and through. They spoke French, English, and Ojibwe, and they ran the fur trade. And really the British inherited the same people, and then the Americans. Like, if you look at all the interpreters for the treaties throughout this region, they all have French surnames. They're Beaulieu and things like that. Yeah, in the French pronunciation, Beaulieu. And as this happened, there was this guy, Pierre Gaultier de Varenne, Sieur de la Vérendrye, and he was charged. The French said, we're in a real tough situation. After the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, they were trying to make a temporary peace between the French and British. Utrecht is a city in Germany where they negotiated their peace arrangement. And in that one, England claimed all of what's now, was the 13 colonies. And to the north, Hudson's Bay, the French claimed everything else in the Great Lakes and then Louisiana. And they actually went through the Great Lakes, Green Bay, Wisconsin, Fox River, Wisconsin River, Mississippi River, to get to Louisiana because they had a significant naval disadvantage to the British and Spanish in the Caribbean. And so it's kind of weird, but it's really a clunky way to get down there, but that's what they were doing. And so they needed all the natives in here. And they charged La Vérendrye, find us the passage to the Western Sea. Now, there is one. It's just 3,000 miles of the roughest terrain on planet Earth across the Canadian Rockies and stuff like that. But they thought, over the next hill, it's going to be there, And so it's really interesting. He comes up to Grand Portage, what's now Grand Portage, Minnesota. And at that point in time, there were Cree people living there in that part of the Iron Range. And this, really the line between Cree and Dakota territory is right in your neighborhood. But there's this Cree guy who says, oh, you're looking for the Western Sea. Well, I can tell you exactly what you need to do. He takes out a piece of birch bark and he draws them a map. It's really cool. The map survives. It's in a museum today. I've only seen pictures of it, but it's pretty interesting. And so he draws them this map. Now, when I look at that map, I cannot tell what he's doing. But it's like you can make a case that he's actually drawing a map of how to get to the Pacific Ocean. Like that the big lakes on there are Great Slave Lake and things like that going all the way out. You can also make the case that he's really just drawing a map of like Rainy Lake and Lake of the Woods and Cree territory, right? You can argue that both ways. It kind of doesn't matter what he was intending to do. It matters what the French, how they understood that. He's like, hooray, the passage to the Western Sea. They brought all their folks. They formed a strong relationship with the Cree. And then the Cree were like, they're so clever. They're like, as our brothers, then we need to adopt your son as one of our own. And so he's like, what am I going to do? To let these savages adopt my son? Well, I'll have to acquiesce. We can't let them take us for cowards. And, so they adopt his son. He's an adult. But then, the next spring, the Cree say, well, we're going to war. And there's a Dakota community, what's now Red Lake, Minnesota. And all of our brothers are coming with us. Right? And so they bring Jean-Baptiste, who is, the son of La Vérendrye. And so and one other French guy. They come down there, the Cree, and also the Assiniboine, they actually speak Nakota, but they're allied with the Cree. They come down, they make an attack. Not too many people die. But the Dakota are like, who's attacking us? They could see a couple of white guys standing with everybody, right? And they're like, oh, it's the Frenchmen. They go back, right? It's all kind of manipulative, right? Well, now the Dakota are like, what? In the interim, the Ojibwe had formed a peace agreement with the Dakota. So the Ojibwe had active direct trade with the French. The Dakota did not because they're further west. And so they were on friendly terms, the Ojibwe and Dakota. And the Ojibwe would take Dakota furs, trade them with the French, bring them guns and things like that. But over time, by the time La Vérendrye is going, it's in the 1730s. And he has already got some French traders in some of the Dakota communities. And so the Dakota are freaking out. They're like, we're trading with the French. They're our friends and allies. And now we just got attacked by them. If we go kill all these people, then how are we going to trade? And so they call upon their allies, the Ojibwe, and say, let's go teach these people a lesson. But they don't harm any French people living in Dakota communities. Instead, they go up to Lake of the Woods, and they caught Jean-Baptiste and Father Alwez, and they caught 19 other French fur traders, which is most of the fur traders in the Rainy Lake of the Woods district. Killed them all. Chopped their heads off, wrapped each one in a beaver pelt, put them in a circle, and the message was, you had a council and made a decision to attack us, that's what happens to you. They went home, right? La Vérendrye, he's like, they killed my boy. You know, he takes all of his, you know, guns, tobacco, trade goods, piles them up, and he says, we are going to wage a genocidal war on the Dakota. And so he calls on all of everyone in his network. So the Assiniboine and the Cree are happy to oblige, but they're also, he's talking to the Ottawa, to the Potawatomi, and they send Cree ambassadors to come to the Ojibwe. And the Cree say this, listen, we're going to wipe these people out. That's what we're going to do. The French are behind us, and you can join us and have the spoils of war. Or you can stick with them, and you're going to go down too. But if you want to be friends with the French, and the Cree, and the Assiniboine, and the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa, you'll join us. And so now the Ojibwe are in a predicament. What do we do? You know? We're married, there's French people living in and amongst and around us all over the place. And ultimately they decide, all right, let's hedge our bets, let's make one little attack on the Dakota, we'll break our alliance, but we're not going to take too much risk. Well, there's a smallpox epidemic amongst the Assiniboine. They threw so many furs into the river you couldn't see water, it's just fur going down the river. And the Cree and Assiniboine never mustered the strength for their attack. Here are the Dakota waiting for a potential response from up there, and instead they only get attacked by their longtime friends, the Ojibwe. Game on. So and the Dakota had even offered the Ojibwe settlement rights in parts of northern Wisconsin as trade allies and so forth. So they push them out immediately. The Ojibwe held on to Madeline Island and actually had an advantage in warfare with the Dakota because of the birch bark canoes, larger, more buoyant. They could keep sentries and float out and start swamping canoes. The Dakotas had tree trunk dugouts. And after that, it was on. La Vérendrye goes back. He's like looking for more guns and ammo and whatever. And his superiors say, you are an idiot. You were supposed to make peace with all the natives, find us the passage to the Western Sea. You abandoned your entire charge. You got a bunch of people killed. You're fired. All right, so he's out. But the war went on for like 150 years. The Cree, true to their word with the Ojibwe, offered the Ojibwe settlement rights here and said, for your work in our alliance, you can come here and set up villages. And so some of the first Ojibwe migrants to the Iron Range were actually displaced from northern Wisconsin in the initial Dakota attacks and came up here and settled. And then over time, there were waves of migration, Ojibwe migration. And it's really the intense conflict period between the Ojibwe and Dakota is going from the 1730s really up until probably the 1780s. And that's when most of the territory shift is going on. There's still some as the Ojibwe push out onto the plains in both Manitoba and North Dakota. That's still going on in the early 1800s. But the territory is pretty much settled down, by the time you're at 1800 or so in most places. There's back and forth war parties, but then it's like 20 people go on a war expedition and catch one person kind of thing, rather than the 1,200 warriors coming and displacing a whole village or something like that.
So were there actually people inhabiting this region?
Yeah.
Here before? Was it Dakota?
Well, right here, Cree, just south and west of here, Dakota. And so Leech Lake was Dakota, Red Lake was Dakota. Yeah, up here, right around Grand Portage and coming in here, parts of Boys Fort, Cree. And that probably shifted just a little bit over time too. But the big change happens in the 1730s after that war blows up. And I think it would be a pretty stressful time to be native here, warfare usually happened in the summer, but if you went out netting or hunting, are my kids going to be alive when I come back, But if I don't, how am I going to keep them alive through the winter? Yeah, must have been pretty tough. Yeah?
Are there any records of how the Ojibwe dealt with the
Yeah, so there's a lot to say there too. You know, the initial Ojibwe interactions with white people were French folks. And so, like, even as the Ojibwe arrived here, a lot of Ojibwe people were already biracial. And a lot of people had deep French connections. And there's a shift too, you know, like the folks that the French, you know, had employing in the fur trade, they might look and be quite native in terms of their biology, but, you know, their economic, political, religious interests are very French. And so that shifts over time as, you know, eventually, like the French are pretty open and inclusive on this part of the frontier. But once you've got white settlement, the ideas start shifting around, and then a brown Catholic French Ojibwe person has a harder time integrating, you know, into a white community. Some do. Some form separate communities, the Métis. And so, you know, there's a different wave of immigration, and it happens very fast. So, you know, the La Vérendrye stuff is going on in the 1730s. French and Indian Wars in the 1750s, you know, and then the larger 7 Years' War between the French and British gets concluded in 1763. And so that's when the British are really sending people here. 25 years later, you got the American Revolution. Only 25 years later, that's in one person's lifetime. And so, you know, now the Americans, it's really like 1805 before they send Zebulon Pike. He's the first official expedition. And then it's going to be decades before there are numbers of people coming here. The treaties are going on, you know, in the middle of the 1800s. 1854 is the one that affects right here in Virginia. So, and then settlement really opens up, white settlement opens up after that. By then, Ojibwe people really had their hands full. You know, they were under a lot of pressure. The Dakota were like being totally displaced from Minnesota by the US government. There were a lot of Native people being moved to Oklahoma, and the power dynamics shifted very quickly. So, you know, I think the Ojibwe were interesting. They, and fared better than many tribes. The Ojibwe did not like go to war with the US government. But they weren't as accommodating as like the Cherokee. So they just tried to negotiate for the best that they could, and sometimes threatened conflict. And the fact that there's so many Ojibwe in Canada and that people could hide their children from conflict zones and field warriors that way. During the Civil War, the British are supporting the Confederacy. There are all these complications that make it harder to just run over on the Ojibwe. So, and I think for the social experience with the first, you know, kind of like in the American settlement period, German and Scandinavian settlers who are coming here, you know, certainly there were tensions and hard times, but I think Ojibwe people were also trying not to make unnecessary dramas and trying to accommodate during a time that was extremely painful and horribly unfair. I mean, they needed land to feed their families. The land was just being taken away, and they're moving someone else in for free, you know, to use the resources that they understood had been promised to them in perpetuity. Yeah.
Yeah, it just makes you think that there must have been a feeling of displacement.
Oh, for sure.
In the late 1800s, really, so many people.
Yeah, well, there was a displacement, so it must have felt like that. Right. Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting, like the Ojibwe at the time understood relations to land differently than we might now, right? So like right, title, convey, you know, survey, contract, those are all foreign terms. What the Ojibwe understood is that there's certain lands that you could exclude other people from, like kill some Dakota, chase them out, and say that's mine and mine alone. They understood that. They also understood that there was some land that you shared with other people. And they had shared use areas with the Cree and some shared use areas with the Dakota, even in times of conflict. Both groups could send in hunting parties or whatever. And so when the initial treaty period happens, the Ojibwe understanding at the time is that we are going to change a chunk of our territory from our exclusive use to shared use. And that white people will be allowed to come in and have farms and settle, or to mine. But that does not mean we are agreeing to alienate ourselves from any of this land. And this is still like the legal issue that's unresolved with the 1854 here, is that the Ojibwe understanding is that they did not sell this land. They agreed to share its use with the newcomers. And it's an important distinction, and a number of treaty cases, one in the Upper Peninsula with the Keweenaw Ojibwe, it defined exactly that the Ojibwe did not exclude themselves. And that's why there are all these clauses in the treaties like the 1854, 1842, 1837 that go across Wisconsin and Michigan that say the Ojibwe retain the right to hunt, fish, gather, and use this land as ceded heretofore kind of stuff. So that's the Ojibwe understanding. And that as other people came to settle, that didn't feel like a violation. But as Ojibwe people went to hunt and fish and were prohibited from doing so, that felt like somebody made a promise, you know, the equivalent of putting your hand on a Bible. Well, we had a pipe ceremony and an open treaty negotiation, and then they violated their word.
We have kind of conflict about fishing rights and hunting rights.
Right.
Out of season, for anglers, to see the native, the Ojibwe people.
Right. Yeah.
Doing their property promised to do.
Right, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that people don't know much about the history, right? So like the barometer is, if they get to do it, I should get to do it too. If I can't do it, they shouldn't get to do it either. It doesn't seem fair to me, you know? But what they're not understanding is this whole context of the agreement, that there was a retained use right, you know, not just implicit in the understanding, but explicit in the agreements too. And that, you know, let's just face it, it's kind of the American way, right? Like, one president makes a trade deal and the next one rips it up and says, screw that. You know what I mean? Like, it's the American way not to honor agreements. You know, there's like, and there's all the gotcha stuff, like you rent the car and you pay for the extra insurance and you crash the car and you find out then that they have to debit your existing insurance company on your own car before they'll actually go into that one, haha, you know. And so that's the American standard, but the Ojibwe standard, and really that of other tribes, is very different. You know, it's like you smoke a pipe, you invoke our creator, and then, you know, it's an additive process. So people add their thoughts, their goodwills. Sometimes they're different thoughts and opinions. You arrive at a consensus and it's already binding because their creator has, you know, witnessed all of this, you know, and so it just feels very different. You know. Yeah?
You have said Ojibwe in all your conversation, but yet I've heard Chippewa
Yes.
and Anishinaabe.
Yes.
And
I should have started with terminology.
yeah, could you start there?
Yeah.
Because I don't know what I'm...
No, you're right. So Ojibwe is the Ojibwe word for this specific tribe. And French dudes were trying to write down Ojibwe, and they wrote Ojibwe, Jibwe, Chippewa, Chippewa, boom, and it stuck. And then they wrote a bunch of maps and documents, and it made its way, like, even if you look at the Constitution for, like, you know, Boys Fort, you know, it's really the Minnesota Chippewa tribe and the Boys Fort band of Chippewa Indians of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. That's the official nomer, and it's in their Constitution. And natives are as testy about changing their constitutions as Americans are about changing theirs. You know, so it's been slower to evolve. But Chippewa is not offensive, it's just mildly erroneous, you know. And then Anishinaabe is another word in our language, and that's also commonly used, and that's a reference to like any native person. So we would call Dakota, Cree, you know, they're all Anishinaabe. But it is a little like Ojibwe-centric to use that. You know what I mean? Right? Like the Dakota would be like, you're calling us Anishinaabe. We're Dakota Oyate. right? And so sometimes people may, implicitly understand it's these Algonquian groups like Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi. We all have the same word in our language, Anishinaabe, that we would use for natives. Yeah.
So if I'm speaking generically, I can say Anishinaabe about any group.
Yeah, the one true way is the Ojibwe.
But if I'm talking,
Ojibwe, Anishinaabe. Yeah.
just try to get it straight.
You got it, yeah.
And then I had another question too. You
Okay.
mentioned the Boy Sport Band. They and the LaCroix Band were all together at one time. What happened there?
Yeah, well, we didn't cross any borders. The borders crossed us. I mean, that's the short answer. Yeah, really the families, like the Good Sky family, for example, they're both sides of the border. They're the same. Like the family tree's just got a couple of roots, really. Those two communities are very interconnected. And, geoproximate, like they're right next to each other, right? So it just kind of makes sense. But, Native people got around by water and canoes and stuff like that. And roads are new, So yeah, that was just an issue of demarcating lines and things like that, more than anything. Yeah.
A few years ago, the Historical Society sponsored Linda Lagarde Grover,
Oh yeah.
professor at UMD of Native Studies, and that's when I first learned about the boarding school in Treuer.
Oh yes.
And is there one in Cloquet too? Or
Yep.
was there one in Cloquet? And about what time period did those start?
Yeah, so the boarding schools in the U.S. started in 1879 is when it was official. They were really debating it for some years before that. But then it was mandatory. And so they started enrolling 20,000 Native kids a year in the U.S. And really scaled it up. And they dominated education for Native kids from, that time really until World War II.
Yeah, Linda said her grandparents were at Treuer.
Yep, and then it was like a slow fade after that. So they were still there were schools closing every decade in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, like Chillicothe closed in the 80s. There's still 4 of those schools in operation today. But they've been reformed, so they're not
in
like
the country or in Minnesota?
in all of the country. There's still 4 left. They're all run by the federal government, and those ones have been reformed. They're not like beating people for speaking their language now, and they don't keep cemeteries for the kids. But it was a slow change to get there. It's still crazy to me that they even have those, but it's voluntary. Like some Native families are like, we will send our kids there. They're like, this kid's in trouble. I want to get him the heck out of this community. We'll send him there. The residential school model is appealing to some. I know one guy, his family went to Haskell, which is down in Kansas, for 5 generations. Compulsory, stolen from the home, compulsory, voluntarily, and then eventually they converted the campus to Haskell Indian Nations University. It's a tribal college, voluntary. Yeah, crazy, right? So, and it's weird, like in both the US and Canada, the government couldn't build schools fast enough to accommodate what they were requiring of the Native communities, so they subcontracted the administration of many schools to churches. So in Canada, 60% of the schools are run by the Catholic Church. In the US, the Catholic Church was busy in the business, but not as high a percentage. Episcopalian Church, Lutheran Church, they all ran different schools. And some of those were smaller and located closer or even in Native communities, White Earth, Cloquet, Tower, places like that. But a lot of the big ones, Carlisle's in Pennsylvania, Haskell's down in Kansas. And they were initially trying to get kids away from their communities so they couldn't, run home or parents couldn't see them and stuff like that. But it shifted. My grandmother went to residential boarding school. She's still alive too, by the way, 98 years old now. And even her experience, when her mom went to residential boarding school, it was good hard beating, forbidden to speak language. For her, it's still forbidden to speak the language. she said she got more beatings from her fellow students than from her teachers, you know, and it was a little shift. And I know some other people who, you know, were like, well, you know, during the Great Depression, 3 hots in a cot sounded pretty dang good, you know. And so you run across a spectrum, even shifting over time. You know, and bear in mind, the British have believed in like having schools raise their kids for quite a long time. You know, it wasn't thought of as like, let's oppress these people. They thought they were going to do favors for them. Of course, the effects, totally different matter. Yeah, tell me when I need to quit, but go ahead.
Yeah, I want to talk some more about language.
Yeah.
Humans, unlike most other species, are generalists. So we've always used mobility as a problem-solving tool, which is, we're an example of that here.
Yeah.
And I share something with your father, and I grew up in a refugee camp in Austria after World War II, and so English is my third language. I ran into, and we lose our languages. I never spoke English with my grandparents. At the Sagibaga powwow a few weeks ago at Net Lake, met a young woman from Fond du Lac who just got her 2-year degree in language studies, and she wants to be an Anishinaabe teacher. And I said to her, go to Lac La Croix. Go to a place where people don't talk English. Well, they do talk English there, but you will be in a setting where you will hear your native language on a daily basis. And when I taught Spanish, I said to kids, look, if you want to learn Spanish, go wash dishes in a restaurant. Because all you will hear is Spanish, and you will become accustomed to it. So I know you're involved with keeping the language going.
Yeah.
And it needs to be done at a very young age. You need to be immersed by the time you're 7 years old. Because by the time you're 15, your brain isn't plastic enough to get the timing signals right to speak perfectly. So,
yeah, appreciate that. There's a lot to say about language revitalization, and yes, I think any successful language learning effort does involve an immersion experience. And, you know, a community like Lac La Croix, where most people are speakers, offers a decent opportunity to do that. The Severn region, and you know, has really high fluency rates, 100% in some of the communities, other good places to do that. But it's difficult with a language like Ojibwe that's highly endangered in most places. And so, like, you know, Boys Fort, I think they've identified, you know, half a dozen. Yeah, we're really down. So ultimately, the other ways to do that are, you know, creating an immersion opportunity, like as a bubble. Language nest, this is what the Maori have done with the revitalization of Maori. The Hawaiians have done this with the revitalization of Hawaiian, with, you know, early childhood education that's grown. In Hawaii, you can actually go to school K-12 and get a college degree, all Hawaiian medium. But 30 years ago, their language was illegal for use in public schools, and there are only 1,000 speakers left. So they're at 24,000 speakers, and so they're one of the success stories in the U.S. And there are efforts to do that with Ojibwe. So Hayward Lakes area in Wisconsin has kind of our flagship immersion school, Wadukudaring. I'm on the school board there now, and there's some really exciting stuff going on. So I got a whole other book on that. It's called The Language Warriors Manifesto, about language revitalization. And there are other places, free resources. It'd be First Speakers Restoring the Ojibwe Language. There's a free video. You know, you could just look for it on YouTube or something.
I had a deal with a tech support guy, and I said, where are you located? He said, the Philippines. I said, boy, did you go to university in the States? Because your English is really good. He said, no, I just locked myself in a room for 3 months and only watched American television.
Yeah.
So, immersion doesn't necessarily have to be.
There are a lot of ways to go at it. Of course, the best way is if That's just the natural language you're hearing growing up in a home. If you can't do that, you find the other ways. Yeah. I'm working hard on them. My oldest daughter is really great. She just finished college, but she's on our team. We've been developing Rosetta Stone for Ojibwe and working on books. And so she pairs up one-on-one with fluent speakers and records and transcribes and translates and stuff. So she's doing really great. The other ones are in like varying levels of ability. My wife from the Swedish American tribe and I often speak English, even though I'm working on her too. So that makes a big difference. Yeah. All right, one or two more, and then we'll when we break too, I'll just perch here and I can take more questions and stuff like that while you mill around and come after books. Yeah.
Are there people who are compiling how the Ojibwe use the native plants in this area and what they use them for? And if so, what would be a credible reference you'd recommend?
Yeah, there are people who are doing work with Ojibwe ethnobotany. So a couple places to look. The Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission is doing a lot of ongoing work with that. They have some that's web-based, but they have 2 books that are published. I think it's like Plants of the Great Lakes Ojibwe or something like that. And they've got the scientific nomer, the Ojibwe name, and common uses and stuff like that in there, and then some imagery. So that's pretty helpful, I think, as far as reference materials go. And then there's some other books, like Wendy Genius has one about Ojibwe ethnobotany. It's a little more academic and less, on plant identification, and more just about the field. But, that's another piece that can help you get at it. All right.
One thing I've noticed about when you talk about other groups and other ways, you talk very respectfully. And I was wondering, did you learn that from your parents or your education? Do you know what I'm asking?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of people who probably could use a lesson on how to be decent to other people. Yeah. That's just like human psychology stuff. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I do feel like both of my parents, for different reasons, I think my father could tolerate no form of oppression after his painful experience with oppression. He was always standing up for whoever and nobody was listening to. And my mother, in her own way, too, and I suppose they modeled and showed me a few things, but I mean, there's one race, it's the human race. Something else I really appreciate about, just about indigenous culture and my Ojibwe culture is that it's one thing to say we're communal, but it's another thing to see how that actually works. And as opposed to the heavy focus on individualism and competition that we see in mainstream culture, if your value is not being more than, better than, standing out from, but is your ability to contribute to, connect to, and support others, it's a very different disposition. And that doesn't mean that Ojibwe people couldn't be mean or something like that, or that, we haven't been touched by colonization and things like that too sometimes, but there's something more than a vestigial remnant of a different way to do things. And I think, within the cultural toolbox, there's a lot of really beautiful stuff there. And I see it when I'm raising my kids, when we have a ceremony, when someone harvests their first time harvesting an animal when they're hunting, or when girls become women, and these things that are really powerful ways to ground people in that frame and way of thinking. And I think as human beings, until 10,000 years ago, we all survived because we were communal. All of us, everywhere. It was our ability to rely on our neighbors, and we harvested together, and then we just took what we needed out of the common food cache. And it's been since the dawn of the agricultural age and striations in society in many places that we've become disconnected from that. And so I think we are hardwired psychologically to need human connection and community. And even for those of us who do the best at exhibiting individualism and competition and materialism, still feel there's something missing and crave those kinds of things. So, and by the way, it doesn't mean that those, like the mainstream cultural things, don't serve some positive values and purposes. They can and do, but I think sometimes it can be a little more dehumanizing to live and operate that way. So I try to be conscious of it. I got a little boost from some of my cultural background, but I mean, we all have to decide how we want to be, you know. There are even cool books like The Anatomy of Peace. I don't know if you ever read that one. This Jewish guy and Arab guy who both lost their fathers in Arab-Israeli violence, who created a peace institute. And the story begins with this like white suburban family bringing their juvenile delinquent kid there and saying, fix him. You know, not realizing that they'd so objectified their own kid that they saw him as a problem that needed to be fixed, and they lost their influence with him. So the family had to go on a big journey, you know, through this thing. But they've got some great guidance just about how to be. Like how many times we've dropped a piece of food and left it for our spouse or the janitor. Like saying their energy to bend over and pick that up is less valuable than my energy to bend over and pick that up. And that we, in so many different ways, even to the people we love and care about the most, that we say we'd, you know, take a bullet for, we still dehumanize in all these ways. And so to generate awareness and then ways of dealing with people and things, this is a good book. All right, time. I'm getting the time signal. So I just wanted to say thank you to you all. You've been great. I could tell we could keep going for hours, but I will let you mill around. There's a bathroom downstairs. I'll perch up here and I will sell some books and visit and take some more questions. You've been great. Thank you so much.